So we'd like to jump right into a discussion on all of the charges that were presented today across the state. And my first guest, thankfully, is here to make sense of it all for us. He is legal expert Paul DerOhannesian. He is joining us now in the studio. Thank you for being with us. I do appreciate it. So first, I think it's important for us to establish a bit of a legal technicality, which is that these are complaints, not indictments. It has been sort of loosely used and thrown around, that term. An indictment is not a complaint. They could be turned into an indictment, which we have seen in the past, but they're not yet there.
Exactly. It's a way of initiating the criminal case. It's a way of putting out there your charges and some information, in this case, lots of information. And it can also be an invitation to any of these individuals that, you know what, here's what we have against you. If you're interested in cooperating, you have an opportunity before we indict you.
So we're going to see, but you can be arraigned on charges that are set forth in a complaint.
Absolutely, because it is a criminal charge. You see it happens even in state court that people are arrested on a charge, could be murder, could be something else, and then the case is presented to a grand jury and there's an indictment, which may change those charges. We saw, for example, in the Silver case, he was arrested on a complaint, eventually became an indictment. There will have to be an indictment for these cases and charges to be pursued.
Okay, so you mentioned regarding cooperating individuals. Let's start there. 9 people with the U.S. Attorney were mentioned in this complaint. 8 people were arrested and or turned themselves in. The 9th pleaded guilty yesterday. His name is Todd Howe. He's a former lobbyist. He's got a long-standing history with the Cuomo family dating back to former Governor Mario Cuomo. He actually hired Joe Percoco, if I'm not mistaken, to work for Mario Cuomo. He's cooperating, and he's mentioned in the complaint as providing information, which means that in between yesterday and today, they were still updating this complaint. Why is he important and his cooperation
He's very important because, number one, it answers a question people may have had, which is, why haven't we heard anything about this investigation? It's clear they were looking for someone to cooperate and nail down what certain actions and words meant. And what's important in this complaint is that they're identifying their witness who's going to give meaning as to the intent, as to equivocal conduct and equivocal words. That's one of the keys in these cases. For example, is a meeting criminal or not? The only way you know is to know what's behind someone's mind, and here he is identified many times as providing the necessary components of intent from a prosecutor's perspective.
So he can, while emails that go back and forth referring multiple times to ZD, which the prosecutors or investigators are fairly certain refers to bribes, to money that's changing hands, Todd Howe can say, yes, that's what we meant when we used that code word.
That's right. The meaning of words, but also that it was an attempt to conceal behavior and conduct. And of course, the question, you've already seen this from the defense today, is he credible and reliable as a witness?
Right. Well, that was the statement that was made by Joe Percoco's attorney. He's pleading not guilty, and the attorney said that this case was an overreach and questioned the veracity of Todd Howe's statements. Now, we've seen reports in the New York Times about questionable personal financial dealings by Todd Howe. He had problems with his own money. He wrote a bad check. I believe he has a criminal history. He failed to return a rental car, which, as it turns out, is a felony. How much of a weakness is that, the veracity of your cooperating witness?
This complaint doesn't set forth the weaknesses of the prosecution witnesses. Those are all very important factors that the defense would want to focus on, because is he the main source of the meaning of these words and the intent of the parties involved? If you look at it that way, he's very important and his background would be very crucial. That's why I think the prosecutors would like to have someone else other than Todd Howe cooperating and making their case, because if their whole case rests on him, then it is attackable.
So it could be, I'm speculating here, but it seems like the next most likely individual that you would seek to put pressure on to cooperate would be Calieros, because he's not just facing federal charges, but he's also facing state charges. He's been suspended without pay by SUNY, and so he has incentive, one might argue, and you know, when you cooperate, you can negotiate with the prosecutor for like a lesser sentence, for a lesser charge, a lesser sentence, etc.
That's the typical playbook.
Right.
And there's many individuals, not just him, who would be vulnerable, I think, to wanting to plead guilty for some reason, whether it's to not only lessen a sentence, but also you got to remember collateral consequences, jobs, bids, things like that that are affected. And if you notice here, Percoco's wife is mentioned many times.
Indeed.
She's not charged. That makes him also vulnerable, I think, because quite often there's an attempt made not only to give gifts to family members, but also to protect family members when it comes to this part of the case.
Well,
so I think
okay.
that's something else that is, I think, very obvious in this case, is the role of an individual, the wife of a defendant who has not been charged.
Well, and she's not been charged even though it was through her. She was the conduit for much of this ill-gotten cash. I mean, it was this energy company that was seeking to influence the Cuomo administration regarding a $900 million power plant in the Hudson Valley and to get favorable treatment from the administration. And according to the complaint, the Percoco family was in a bad way financially. I mean, they had $20,000 a month in bills and about almost $9,000 a month in salary coming in because his wife gave up her job in 2012, and so this energy company paid her $7,500 a month to do, according to the U.S. Attorney, almost nothing. Show up maybe 25 hours a week, at most a month, as little as 2 to 3 hours a week a month. That's really an MO of this prosecutor in particular. You have experience with this because you've represented clients with him. He tries to leverage family members against an accused. He does that
absolutely.
all the time.
Absolutely, and I think in this complaint, it's a critical part, not only of the accusations, but in terms of what might happen next, as well as the vulnerability of Percoco to, again, having his wife perhaps charged in this case if he does not cooperate. And I think that's an interesting part of this, is how much they put in here about someone who's not charged.
Okay, let us talk about sort of like the elephant in the room. Both of these prosecutors were asked, what kind of exposure does the governor have? I mean, obviously he's the person at the top of the heap here. He is known as a micromanager and a person who has his hands in everything. He's very, very close to Joe Percoco and has been for years. He has a long history with Todd Howe as well. And so the question to the U.S. Attorney was, is he involved? Any exposure? The U.S. Attorney's response was, all he could say at this moment was that there's nothing in this complaint. The investigation is ongoing. The State Attorney General said something similar, which is, today there is nothing regarding the governor. Now, is it standard operating procedure to leave the door open, or does this indicate trouble for the governor down the road?
You have to be very careful in this situation. And I think that's what the prosecutors are doing. They're being very careful because right now there really is nothing. You know, presidents of companies, elected officials have people working for them quite frequently who do something they shouldn't do. It does not necessarily mean that they become guilty as a result of that. And I think right now, based on what we have, there is no reason to go beyond what this indictment says, which is you have an individual, as you pointed out, who is financially strapped and looking to make money for himself. And I think that's an interesting observation here. As you pointed out, he had severe financial problems. So did the person who pleaded guilty. And these are individuals who presumably were making a lot of money legitimately. Why did they fall into this predicament? And I think that's what's an interesting aspect of this case also.
So if, and again, the U.S. Attorney was asked, is it realistic to believe that a person who has a reputation of being a hands-on manager and has such a close relationship with one of the individuals involved in this case, Joe Percoco, and we're speaking of Governor Cuomo, is it realistic was the word that was used in the question, to believe that he knew nothing? The U.S. Attorney's response is, it's not my job to speculate on what's realistic and what isn't. My question to you is, if he knew and turned a blind eye, is that enough to charge him with something? Is there some illegality there?
I don't believe that just knowing something may have been wrong is enough. There has to be more in terms of making a criminal case, and I think any prosecutor is going to look for more than that there may have been a suspicion or something like that just isn't enough. And that's why there's no other person charged here.
The State Attorney General was a little defensive when he was asked, why is it that you're having a separate investigation, you're bringing separate charges, you're working in cooperation, you had to not step on each other's toes with the State Attorney General, and he said, with the U.S. Attorney, and he said, well, there are state and federal laws that have been violated here, and so therefore we're bringing state and federal charges. Is that, and he sort of laid that out as something that's fairly routine. Is it indeed routine?
It would be routine that if prosecutors from different agencies, just like in the state system, different counties are working on a case, that at some point they would decide who gets what. And it's clear that the U.S. Attorney in the Southern District is captain of the ship and is the one that has made the major determinations here as to what he wants to pursue. If he wanted to pursue these charges and these individuals and didn't want the AG to do it, he could have made that decision is my opinion, and I think most people would say that. But it's sort of like going to war. Every branch wants to have a piece of the action. We need something for the Marines to do and the Navy to do. And I think here too that they wanted to have something that the Attorney General could prosecute and bring, and I think that decision was made. These are the type of decisions that prosecutors engage in all the time. It's sort of like the internal politics of any organization as to who's going to get what assignment.
Okay, so we're going to run out of time, and really, and we're going to have to bring you back and talk more about this case these cases as they evolve. But I do want to sort of, generally speaking, you have some thoughts on what this means. I mean, and again, the U.S. Attorney, who was very careful not to be too showboaty, because in the past he has really excoriated Albany and gotten admonished by a judge for it. Sort of a pox on all their houses in Albany is just a terrible place, etc. He also said that the city is lovely. Apparently, Kathy Sheehan, the mayor, has gotten to him on that particular thing. Albany is not a state government. It's a yes. Well, so she was upset. So anyway, the question is, all of these ethics reforms that we've seen time and again, the hue and cry for ethics reforms or campaign finance reform, et cetera, what's been done up until this point apparently is not the remedy, because we're still seeing these sorts of cases being brought.
There's several observations. Number one, what you pointed out about the prosecutor's comments, this complaint, I think, is still going to be challenged by the defense as perhaps going beyond the limits of what's
we've
proper.
already seen that,
You're going to see that. That's one thing.
Yep.
But I also think there's obviously much more here. This case, this complaint tells you, too, how vigorously they're looking at other matters, perhaps. But I think also, I've said this before and I'll say it again, I just don't think prosecution is the way to change the system. This has been going on for a long time, whether it's this legislature, whether it's other states. You still see that this behavior will continue unless there's fundamental reforms from within. Campaign finance, disclosure laws don't do the trick. I think it's a very ineffective way to try to bring change.
Well, and we're out of time, but I just want to say, running along a parallel track, ironically, the Legislative Pay Compensation Commission held its final public hearing today in New York City and is considering some very significant potential pay raises for lawmakers and for executive chamber and commissioners. So, you know, some have suggested that that's the answer, no more outside income. I don't know that anybody would say paying individuals in state government more is a good idea after learning all of this. But clearly, there's a financial component, and the governor himself has said it's hard for him to attract good talent because pay, which is governed by law, is too low vis-a-vis the private sector. So, Paul, we'll have you back. I thank you so much. 80 pages of the State Attorney General's complaint. It's
Lots
really
to absorb.
Fascinating reading. Yeah. So I recommend everybody download it and take it somewhere quiet. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.